on what speed we can attain in this transition. Our next keynote speaker, Jos Delbeke, was the Director General of the European Commission DG Climate Action from its creation, 2010 until 2018. Lieve.
Jos Delbeke is professor at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and also at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And as an economist, he underlines the role of market-based instruments and cost-benefit analysis in the field of the environment. Professor Delbeke was heavily involved in setting the European climate and energy targets for 2020 and 2030, and he was a key player in developing European legislation on the emission trading scheme. You all know there is certain sectors in society that have to trade their emissions, cars and fuels, air quality, emissions from big industrial installations and chemicals. In his keynote today, he will focus on climate change and the European Green Deal and their implications on the building sector. Mr. Delbeke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all, and my sincere congratulations to Professor Helsen and Boydens for this exciting subject and taking it further. And congratulations to all to make it work, because Europe is putting in place a Green Deal, as we just heard from Martin Dirksen. There are lots of expectations about what Europe will do, can do, should do. The more rapid, the better. But you know, how to line it all out is what I would like to talk to you about today. And what I will deal with today is giving some briefly facts and figures about where we are and not are on climate change, move on to the Green Deal, and then to zoom in to some of the star measures that Europe is taking forward, and that will be on our table, on your table, on the table of all policymakers in the coming 2-3 years approximately. And then you know, legislative work will have to be rolled out into practical solutions, as we just heard from the thoughts of industry. So where are we today? I think it's a no-brainer to say that climate change is hitting us already. We have seen it not only in California and in China and in many places in the world, but also in the heart of Europe, in the heart of this country, in Germany, in the south of Europe, in the extreme heat and the forest fires. So we have seen it all, and a lot of meteorologists have come to the table, and thank God all scientists in the world came together in the most recent report, the IPCC report, where thousands and thousands of pages of scientific work are being scrutinized, are being debated upon, and conclusions are made. And I dare to make only 3 conclusions out of this heroic work, because important is that all scientists in the world come together. But what is clear to us is that climate change is human-induced. We never saw with that firm assertion that climate change is really a problem, and it is caused by humans. And it is caused by humans because we all consume, since the Industrial Revolution, masses of coal, hard coal, brown coal, but also oil and gas, in short, fossil fuels. What we also see is that the changes that climate change is already hitting us are never seen before. It's unprecedented, it is in many cases irreversible, and it is hitting every region in the world. There was a time where we thought, oh, it's going to be the Bangladeshis and the Africans who are going to be hardly hit. It's not coming to our place, but we saw it differently this year, and we all should expect more of that for the future. So the evidence is getting stronger, and the European institutions and our leaders in Europe were taking strong decisions. Because they got the message that we need deep reductions in greenhouse gases and CO2 primarily, but also in other greenhouse gases like methane, and we have to make them happen now. The coming decade is going to be crucial, and if we don't do that, in the world at large, we are not being able to control climate change below 2 degrees Celsius. And that is what the scientists have brought forward. We should go well below 2 degrees Celsius. That was then noted in the Paris Agreement that the United Nations adopted in 2015. But since then it was even sharpened up. We should go to maximum 1.5 degrees. And we only will get there if we get into action much more actively compared to where we are today. This graph is showing that we are not talking about last year or last month or last decade or last century, but this is about the ice ages as we see them developing, the geological cycle, and the time scale on 0 is the Roman time. And the little red in the back of the graph is the temperature change over the last 100 years. Just to indicate that geologically speaking, we are out of range of what we thought nature would normally create in terms of a normal geological cycle. And that is moving into no man's land. Some would say we go from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, where we have a geological cycle dominated by man. But let's not go into that. What I wanted to say is we are facing up to a real problem that is beyond last month, last year, last decade, last centuries. We are going into possibly another geological cycle, no man's land. But coming back, what can we do? Well, we should be able to cut down our greenhouse gases, and we have good tracing for that. The CO2 emissions for the world at large started going up with the Industrial Revolution. At the moment that we started to use hard coal, not least in this country, which was one of the first countries in the world. It was the first country of the continent that started to dig out massively coal from the underground and got into industrial production. Now you see on the graph that normally in the 1970s we would have seen a stabilization. But since the 1970s, the red zone added to that, and that is the new emerging economies. And to put it a little bit sharp, it is the growth of Asia. And to put it a little bit in an even more shortcut way, it is the industrialization of China. And I do not want to pinpoint to one single country because we are all hanging together in this. But the brutal reality is that CO2 emissions keep increasing. They are not cutting down. They have not been cut down to the extent that it was said it would happen. And we, as I would underline very forcefully, we are hanging all together. And that is why we need the United Nations acting on that, and that is why we need a Paris Agreement. And Europe has developed a strategy into that. Because basically, as I mentioned, the Industrial Revolution started in Europe, in the rich industrial West. So we are in this West responsible for the climate change we are observing today. But the climate change of our children and grandchildren is going to dominate or being dominated more by the emissions of the emerging economies. So with the delaying factor, you know, the greenhouse gas emissions are going into the air and the climate change materializing, we have a clean interest to have all countries in the world, not only in Europe, not only in the United States, not only in Asia, but the whole world moving together, and we need a strong multilateral approach. And that is basically what we achieved in the Paris Agreement in 2015, because all countries committed to control their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, Europe decided to become a laboratory for low-carbon technology and for low-carbon policy. And Europe is doing that because it feels responsible for the phenomena that we are seeing, but it also sees an economic opportunity. Because if the whole world has to move into a low-carbon future, the ones coming forward with the innovations and the technologies we need first may be well placed to win market shares and to win the economic battle in this respect. So it is a bit a mixture of good and well-perceived self-interest, but also with a responsible side where we have to move, we have the experience, we have the brains and the technology, so let's make it work. And technologies do not fall out of the air. Technologies are made by humans, and they are made and helped by authorities that create a framework for action. Now we are moving in the fall, and the fall is always, every year, a new climate negotiation. In Glasgow, the COP26 is going to take place in November. And there is good news out there, because the Paris Agreement, with all the pledges that the countries were making, was not bringing us to the 2 degrees Celsius, let alone the 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was bringing us only up to 3 degrees Celsius. And so Europe decided already in 2019, when the new European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen, took office, to go for climate neutrality in our continent. And that was saying by 2050, we should not have net zero emissions into the atmosphere. And if we still have emissions into the atmosphere, we should have other technologies compensating for that, taking out this carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions from the air. Now, the Europeans were a bit stared at the world level at what the hell are they telling us? But taking the Paris Agreement and the work of the scientists further, this climate neutrality was being focused about by leaders. Europe did a good job, I think, in the G7 and the G20 to bring it on the table. And to our surprise, it was China that followed through as a big continent in 2020, declaring they would do something similar to Europe, but not by 2050, but 2060, which is still a dramatic change that is being embedded now in climate policy of China. It is in its early stages, but it's taken forward. And it needs to be translated further, as we all experience also in Europe. You don't build Rome in one day. You know, it's a step-by-step process. It's very difficult to overcome all barriers that are there. So China is also seeing that coal-fired power generation is still being constructed in China. And in Glasgow in November at COP26, I think the whole world is going to come to inter alia China and many other countries like South Africa or countries like Indonesia, where a lot of coal is being used, and saying, hang on, what are you now going to do? Now, China was followed, and that was the absolute top of the good news, by the United States when President Biden took over from President Trump. You know that President Trump was putting the whole climate policy on ice in the United States, but also was not very proactive internationally, to put it mildly. And the United States, President Biden, in his opening speech and since then, is taking action to make sure they also go for this climate neutral objective by 2050. And this dynamic was set in motion and now creates that many countries, including industrialized countries like Japan and Korea and South Africa and many others, the count is around 60 or 70 today, covering approximately 70% of world's emissions, of global emissions. But still, we are not yet at the well below 2 degrees Celsius. At best, we end up with this 2.4 degrees Celsius that was added. So we are on a path approaching the 2 degrees Celsius, but let's not be complacent. We are not yet there. And so we need more action. So that's why the EU was moving further from setting targets to developing policies. And now we have a Green Deal that says we are not only going to be climate neutral by 2050, but by 2050 it's a long way off. By 2030, what are we going to do? And it was decided first by our political leaders, by the heads of state and government, and then elaborated by the European Commission, that by 2030 we will reduce our emissions with 55% based on 1990. 1990 is the base year of the United Nations. And this graph shows that today there is a bit of good news. Since 1990 and today, we have reduced our emissions in Europe with 24%. So we are not starting from scratch. We have reduced from 24%, and we have not reduced our economic growth and our output, which is good news. We have been able to decouple economic growth from emissions. But on the graph, you see the yellow line, and the yellow line is the 55%. And that puts into perspective that every year we will have to double the amount of emission reduction compared to what we did up till now. So doubling is quite something. And we heard encouraging words from the minister of the Flemish government this morning, but we all know that national authorities, regional authorities, not least Flanders, will have to do much more to bring us in line with twice as much annual emission reduction compared to where we were before. The figure is 2.7% every year. That is a very challenging target. And that is why the Green Deal that the European Commission developed covers the entire economy. It encompasses climate and sustainability concerns, including the circular economy. It goes much wider than just climate. It looks at the whole thing. You know, we cannot talk about climate if we would forget thinking about water, management of water, sea level rise, or precipitation, as we have been seeing in the center of Europe lately. And it covers all economic sectors. In the past, we were concentrating our efforts on energy. Of course, in the energy sector, that is where the massive amount of coal and oil and gas is being used. But it moves now to transport. The electrification of the vehicles is on its way, to industry, in looking for new production methods in the circular economy and construction, your sector, and I will come to that in a moment. Agriculture and forestry, you know, talk to the farmers. They say, we see climate change happening, but when you talk about what are you going to do about it, then it goes more silent. And innovation. Innovation, not only research and development policy, but also translating the results of research and innovation into investments in real life. And that's what you're working about, investments in how you build new infrastructure, how you put up new buildings. That is what matters. It's not only the research, it's translating the research into real economic activity that influences our day-to-day behavior, because that is ultimately what matters. Our day-to-day behavior must produce part of the 2.7% that we have to reach every year. And so the political attention has to, and in Europe has moved from target setting to policies, to measures, to real-life changes that needs to be taken shape. And that rollout is always painful because there is always an interested party, a vested interest that needs to be overcome, and it takes time. It is a gradual process, and that's the frustrating part for you in the practice, but also for the policymakers, that before you translate these policies into laws, it takes a frustratingly lot of time, unfortunately. Now, the Green Deal is going to come back to a massive investment program. And I was very pleased to hear the minister this morning saying that. You know, it is about investments, it is about not only refurbishing our buildings, it is reviewing our transport systems. And the impact assessment of the European Commission reckoned that on top of the normal investment, we would need every year 350 billion additional investment in order to make the Green Deal happen. And that is a hell of a lot of money. And that is why the financial sector needs to come on board with cheap loans or with financial and fiscal incentives so as to make sure that this money is being driven to the purposes of the Green Deal. In industry, we are going to see also massive new technologies coming on the table because steel, for example, is a very carbon-intensive product. We can have transport systems that are almost zero emissions, but cars and buses and trains are made out of steel. So how do we produce steel is the ultimate question. How are we producing chemicals? How are we producing cement? Very CO2 intensive products. And so in industry, there's a whole program how to crack and move away from the traditional, say, blast furnace in steel to hydrogen-based steel fabrication. And the new first industrial applications are already happening today. Last week, it was announced that in Sweden, the first carbon-free steel has been produced, which is an absolutely, important announcement of the changes coming in the traditional sectors of the economy. So the Green Deal is not only about startups and about new companies, it is also about how to change around our normal companies, because without them, we are not going to reach the high amounts of investments that we need. And the European Union, with its funds, is supporting that process. A third of the EU budget and of the Resilience Fund, the Next Generation EU, the Corona Recovery Fund, more than a third must obligatory have a relation to the Green Deal objectives. Otherwise, they are going to be refuted by the European authorities. And you have noticed that the plans that all member states, including Belgium, has been submitting plans and must indicate how the impact is going to be on the greenhouse gas emissions of the country. So the Green Deal is a massive investment program, and the funds available at the European Union are increasingly being turned into that direction. Let's now zoom in on a few specific policy instruments, because this is all general, and macro targets. What specific instruments are there, and which ones are perhaps particularly important for the work you are doing? Now, the EU climate policy is a combination of policy instruments. There is no single instrument that is doing the job. They are partly market-based, the carbon market is there, but also in the banking sector, there is now a regulation applicable as of the 1st of January of next year, where all financial companies must indicate with a third-party verifier what kind of investments they have been doing and what the climate impact is of that. So this disclosure of climate information and sustainable information is now mandatorily already in legislation. So that's the market, driving the market towards this low carbon kind of implementation. But there are, of course, also a wide range of mandatory standards and benchmarks that are necessary in all segments of society, but not least in energy efficiency. We heard Martin Dirks making the point about how Europe has to come forward with clear standards applicable not only for the whole EU, but preferably for the whole world. And I'm going to zoom in on a few of them. And of course, governance. There has been a lot of animosity in this country about the national energy and climate plans that had to be submitted, and that was not good. And the European Commission made that clear, and a new version is being prepared. So the governance system is about following up and how the targets where the authority is left for the national or the regional decision-making needs to be lined out. So that's the structure. And I will zoom in on 5 specific examples. The EU ETS, the carbon market, because the economists have been saying you have to put a price on carbon, because if carbon is free, nobody is going to look at that because then you emit into the atmosphere without paying for it. So we were setting up a carbon market. In 2005 it started, and it reduced its emissions since 2021 by 43%, without touching the output of the sectors involved. And the sectors involved is power generation and manufacturing industry. And the carbon prices today are moving around 55 euros per ton. I was just checking the latest price, and yesterday a new record was hit. Yesterday it was 61 euros per ton. In 2017-18, when we were still suffering from the banking crisis, there was an oversupply in the market. The prices were around 10 euros or even below. So today, you will hear that in steel companies, in cement companies, in the power sector, people start really looking at their carbon emissions because there is a price to be paid. And in the power sector, every ton of CO2 that is emitted into the atmosphere needs to be paid. So the carbon price is going up. With the Green Deal, is expected to go up further, and it's not going to come back. And now comes the proposals. Two things are of particular importance for you all. Of course, with the tightening target, the price is going up. But what about our protection of our industry when other countries in the world are not doing similar actions? And there is a carbon border adjustment mechanism that just has been proposed as part of the Green Deal that puts a tariff at the border for all steel and cement and fertilizers and electricity being imported from other places in the world. There are some countries, not least neighboring countries, who are not doing that much. Without mentioning them, we think and talk about Turkey and Russia and Morocco in the Middle East. They are bringing in massive amounts of this stuff, and our companies have to pay for the carbon, and its price is getting higher. So there needs to be a correction. Of course, this needs to be in line with the World Trade Organization rules, and there's going to be a heated debate about all this. So we are not yet there. It's a proposal. It needs to materialize, but it will force others, not least our neighbors, to go into similar action. And what we see even in China, we buy a lot of stuff in China. China is introducing a carbon market that is a blueprint that they have been taken from the EU. So it's moving. Indonesia is moving. New Zealand, Korea, South Africa, Mexico, they are all looking on why should we not go in a similar manner, because then we can prevent paying the border tariff that the Europeans are going to put up. So a lot of heated debate. Now, the system as it exists is going to be widened, but now a separate adjacent system is going to be created for heating and transport fuels. So the carbon content of heating fuels in buildings is also going to be subject of the carbon market. So in the future, of course, this is a proposal, it still needs to be adopted, but you can reckon that as of 2025, that heating fuels in buildings will be subject to the carbon market, like the steel and cement and other things. And there is also a proposal on energy taxation that is reviewing lots of rates that have been exempted so far that are going to be implemented. So energy use in buildings, and in particular carbon-intensive products, are going to become more expensive. So it's a very important element. The second measure I would like to highlight on is renewable energy. Has been very controversial in the past because it costed a lot of money to drive the renewable energy into the market. But today there is a target by 2030 of 32%, and the member states said they would reach this target. But now the Commission proposed to review that to 40%. And it is not only electricity, it's final energy consumption. So this is, for Europe as a whole, really a game changer. So renewable energy, Europe has taken a leadership Of course, it was joined in that leadership by China and India and other major players in the world, but renewable energy is going to be the norm of the day by 2030 and beyond, and also for buildings. You know, you're familiar with the solar panels, but also with systems where renewable energy can be used into systems. And there is even a proposed standard that at least 49% of energy use in buildings must come from renewable sources. So the benchmark that is being advanced is very important for renewable energy in buildings, and electrification is taking shape, and the heat pump that was mentioned this morning is going to be a star into all this. Electrification of heating systems and of transport and of mobility is on its way. All technologies are on our doorstep. We just have to roll them out and being taken up more actively. So the second pillar of the Green Deal is renewable. The third pillar is energy efficiency. And there we come closer to things that you are familiar with. The target that was defined for energy efficiency is tightened up. And this is good news for the Green Deal. But most countries, including this country and including this region of Flanders, where we are today, is not yet delivering the targets that are legally mandatory as of now. So the strengthening of the energy efficiency first principle is on its way, but local authorities will have to put their shoulders under the whole event. Otherwise, we are going to have a massive debate about who is to be blamed for what. And one of the key things in that energy efficiency directive is that energy savings obligations are put on energy suppliers. That is not only an obligation, but with a target of a 1.5% annual improvement from 2024 on. So the energy providers coming to the buildings that you are talking about will have the pressure on their shoulders to produce every year a 1.5% improvement in energy efficiency. So if you are not invited directly to do that, the energy providers are going to look over your shoulders. Of course, public procurement is very important. Public buildings are very important. There is a suggestion of renovation of public buildings 3% per year, which is massive, but there is no way around it, that we have to renovate much faster. Standard setting is going to happen in the upcoming review of the energy performance of buildings, very much in line with the overall setting of the Green Deal. I mentioned already the governance systems. Let's move quickly over that. Governance means that a lot of detailed obligations are put on the member states. To put them up in their national and energy and climate plans, they have to strengthen the energy audit systems, the energy management systems, metering and billing. We know that the electronic device measuring your electricity consumption at home is unfortunately not going as fast as it should be. So member states are obliged to report what their plans are, how quickly they are going to go, and the Commission and the member states, the neighboring member states, can come back with comments about what is good and what is less good and where things need to be modified. Demand-side flexibility is another one. I think that a lot of tasks are set for the EU as a whole, but are left for operational implementation at the level of the member states. The fourth measure I cannot resist moving or showing you is the CO2 standards for passenger cars. I talked about the electrification of transport. There, Europe is a leader. Again, has been a leader of the pack, the whole pack. You see the lower lines are the EU, but the whole crowd in the world is following through, because basically Europe is the standard setter of the world. And the Japanese, the Californians, and now the Chinese and the Koreans are following basically the European legislation. And so that's why in terms of zero emission vehicles, The Commission has declared that by 2035, all new vehicles put off the market should be zero emissions. So they must have either an electric battery or a hydrogen-driven, or all things that may be invented in between today and 2035. But the orientation is clear with a benchmark for 2030, and we see it already happening. All car manufacturers are switching to electric vehicles. We wait for the mass market to bring the costs down, as we saw in the renewables. As you break open the market and create a mass market, then the costs are going down considerably. And it is expected that in a couple of years, an electric vehicle is going to be distinctly cheaper than a normal engine, convention engine as we are seeing today. And the last measure I would like to draw your attention to is sustainable finance. I was already mentioning in my opening words how much the Green Deal is an investment program. And we want, of course, investments to happen in the right things, not in the wrong things. Otherwise, you go for the famous stranded assets. And that is why the EU has developed a taxonomy. Because frankly, when you are trying to invest your savings in a green manner, you are bombarded with lots of creative decisions or creative definitions. And the greenwashing is a phenomenon that the EU wants to fight. And the taxonomy is outlining what is green and what is not green as a first step towards fighting the greenwashing. And on top of that, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation on banks and industrial companies is coming or has come. For banks, it has come. For normal industrial companies, it is coming soon because the proposal is in the making. So financiers, industrial companies will have to disclose and have the information they are putting forward checked by a third party, say one of the accountancy firms, that what they report about is close to the truth. And this EU regulation is pretty tight, is being rolled out. All the details have not yet been set in stone, but again, the EU wants to set in motion a system worldwide that is currently being followed. And even countries that you would not expect, like China, are already active in this space as well. So I come to the conclusions of my chat because I think the coffee is waiting. We are a bit over time. But on the EU Green Deal, perhaps three conclusions I would like to draw and bring to your attention. That is that the market-based approach is the solid central approach because it brings cost effectiveness. We all know that climate policy and climate measures, when they are not brought forward in a rational economic manner, can be very expensive. So a market-based approach through carbon pricing and through disclosure of information, improved transparency, bring the costs down. And bringing the costs down makes projects much more closer to realization. So that market-based approach is being strengthened, and the carbon pricing is now also extended to heating fuels in buildings, which is, and transport fuels as well, which is not to be underestimated for the work you are all undertaking. Second point is, it is a massive investment program, so it will cost a lot of money. And the money will have to be released. Now, the good news is that interest rates are historically low and may remain low for quite some time because the policy of the European Central Bank is like that. And there is a lot of support out of the European budget and the Next Generation EU, which is the COVID Resilience Fund, the new fund that was created of 750 billion euros, which is a massive amount of money. Historically, we never saw these amounts of money available. And also the ETS, the carbon market, Now that we have a price of 60 euros, this carbon market raises a lot of revenues. And that's why there are funds being specified for that. There are social funds, because if energy becomes more expensive, having the Gilets jaunes experience in the back of our mind, we should compensate the lowest income classes and protect them against fuel poverty. And that is what I was not zooming in on today, but that is where part of the revenues from the ETS are going to be used for, as much as for innovation. The Innovation Fund is growing by the day, and it is supporting lots of activities that were brought forward already this morning. And finally, of course, energy is key. The way we use energy, the way we produce energy, and there is where renewable is so important, but energy efficiency determines how consumers, everyday people, you and me, are consuming energy, and the least we consume out of this energy, the more we save energy, the better. And that is where the building stock is a capital variable. Much more renovation is on its way, and so much more work is going to be on your plate. So success with your endeavors. You are on a very important and critical subject for the realization of the EU Green Deal, and there is a future, a bright future for all of you. Thank you very much.
Professor Delbeke, thank you very much. It sounds like a tight plan, a CO2 type plan, an emission type plan, not watertight. Hopefully it is, then literally speaking. I think everybody enjoyed seeing concrete guidelines on different domains, different fronts, and now the big translation, and then put it into practice and let research guide you to do it in a most effective way, emission effective or cost effective. Be inspired, and to be inspired, I would say we invite you for a coffee. We are flexible. Flexibility is also a big issue, so we have to tighten also that coffee a little bit down. We would invite you to go to the room where the session is you wanted to follow. That means actually you go directly there. Of course, a sanitary stop is no problem. That's one of the reasons for the break. The people who wanted to follow the session here in the concert hall, they just go to the foyer parterre or the second balcony. Okay? And then 10:45, so we would like to restart all the sessions. One more issue, a lot of presenters should, instead of going to the sanitary, they should go to their session room and hand in their presentation, because we see that a lot of presentations have not been uploaded